again, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Racism at Uni, From Report to Real Action. We're delighted to be co-hosting today's session alongside with MindTribes. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Danny White, and I'm one of the partners at Watermark Search International. In our education practice, we partner with public and private higher education institutions, vet providers, and schools to support on executive and board appointments, as well as providing interim executive solutions. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm joining you from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and as we enter National Reconciliation Week this week, I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and celebrate the rich culture, continued connection and custodianship of the land. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Some housekeeping before we get into it. Today's session will run for 1.5 hours. We'll start with a fireside chat to gain perspectives from senior leaders, then move into a panel conversation with operational leaders on practical implementation. And then we're going to finish with a Q&A session. Today will be recorded. It'll be shared with all of those who have registered and also made available on our website following today. So if you miss anything, you'll have the recording and you can go back. We encourage you to use Mentimeter for anonymous questions and contributions to the panel. There will be a dedicated Q&A section at the end as well. So scan the QR code as you see on the screen and you can enter the chat throughout that platform. Watermark is about to release our 12th annual Board Diversity Index report, and we produced this report in partnership with Deloitte and the AICD. The index is a longitudinal study of ASX 300 boards, tracking diversity across gender, cultural background, skills, age, tenure, and more recently we've looked at underrepresented groups. We won't go into too much detail today, however, ahead of the official release on the 10th of June, I'd like to share some early insights. On gender diversity, progress has continued. In 2026, 72% of ASX 300 boards now have more than 30% women directors. Connecting in with today's topic, the picture for cultural diversity, however, is far more concerning. Representation has declined, as you'll see on the graph. This year, only 6.5% of ASX 300 directors come from non-Anglo-Celtic backgrounds, down from 8.1% just last year alone. We ask ourselves, does this represent society, our community? Does it enable boards to see blind spots with such limited diverse lived experience? This gap reflects structural issues in how leadership is identified, sponsored, and appointed. These outcomes don't just emerge at the board table. We know that there is a result of long-term pipeline effects, and universities play a critical role in developing future leaders. Where exclusion or institutional racism is experienced early, the impact can compound over time, limiting progression into executive and governance positions. The reality is visible in our findings, with very limited cultural and First Nations representation at the most senior levels, both in ASX 300 boards and also as an example in Vice-Chancellor positions in Australian universities. Moving into the main section today, I'll hand over to Div Pillay, CEO of MindTribes, Honorary Fellow at Monash University, sitting on the Central Queensland University Strategy and Planning Committee, Board Director at Vic Health, AFR 100 Women of Influence. Div has been working with universities for the past decade in inaugural anti-racism strategies. She brings 24 years as a DEI practitioner and researcher, and currently a PhD student at CQ University. Over to you. Thanks, Div.
Thank you, Danny. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to convene this conversation with Watermark. Just a bit of context before I kick into the fireside chat with our two executive leaders from universities is we convened this webinar because we had a very high inquiry rate from university leaders as the Human Rights Commission's Racism at Uni report launched. You'll note on screen, like, there are 47 recommendations outlined in the paper, and 28 directly connect into university recommendations. So they are spread across 5 outcomes, which you can see on screen. And what we noted from the inquiry is just increasing month on month, is that a lot of leaders were trying to figure out where to from here, how do they start, what's the right thing to do at the right time. And we just have been doing some wonderful university co-design leadership with the panelists and the leaders here today, and we just thought it would be wonderful to share that knowledge and reflective practice with all of you. So I hope you get a lot out of it. Please use the QR code. I'll be watching it as a moderator as we move through the conversation. So as I pick up a question that you've posed, I'll build it into the discussion as best I can, but we've got that reserved time at the end to answer your questions. So let's kick in, and a warm welcome to Michael and to Alec. And it's a moment today to actually have this conversation with you as it marks the start of National Reconciliation Week. So it's particularly poignant, and I'm coming to you from Naarm here in Melbourne on the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So warm welcome. Let's bring you up on screen, Michael and Alec. And I was joking with Michael that I often feel underdressed in his presence because he's such a fashion-conscious person. So I'm missing your cravat today. Anyway, beautiful. So let's kick off. And I've got sort of really, I suppose, personal questions and professional questions to ask you, because I want to be able to give as much as we can to leaders in the audience. So I'll kick off with this first question, noting the Human Rights Commission's reports and this feeling of overwhelm from senior leaders about where to start. Can I throw to you, Michael, and I'll throw next to you, Alec, about what was that moment or evidence that, led you to prioritize or work with your university leaders to prioritize racism at an institutional level? Because a lot of what we're getting inquiries about is just a workshop or training session, which is very interpersonal and individual. But we know La Trobe has done a beautiful job of centering the work and focusing on strategy and planning. So can you cast your mind back? What was that moment? Can you share it?
Again, mine actually was a little bit longer than just my limited experience. I've only been at La Trobe for 3 years, but I have said constantly in educational environments that Australia is a racist society. Now, I confidently will say that. And again, that's built on my experiences. But, the foundations of Australian society were based on that as well. These are savages and we're much better than that. And we will clearly take this because no one lives there and it's our land and we'll take that land, 204 years later, the High Court did state that that was quite false. And, we have a sovereign population living on these lands as well. So again, it was a little bit longer than that. But, I was lucky when I came to La Trobe. They did have a community discuss the idea of an Indigenous strategy, and based within our Indigenous strategy from 2002 is cultural safety. And cultural safety does talk about people being safe on this working environment and building those relationships. So again, it was a really significant part of this institution. They're talking about the safety of all people. And when we talk about, we don't just talk about our students and staff, we also talk about our community as well, and building that trust with that institution. That was really important for us at La Trobe. And again, I was very fortunate that the community was involved in a lot of that before I got here, and I was able to kind of engage with that and work with the community to make sure that they felt safe as well. But that has also led to a few other actions. So we do have an anti-racism strategy that we've been developing since about 2028, 24. And again, because of all the other issues occurring in the world, it's led to, because La Trobe really is a culturally diverse environment with our student population and the northern communities in northern Victoria that we kind of cover. It is a Victorian university, covers the state. The populations that we work with are quite culturally diverse as well. So the idea of having a strategy that we can talk about to make sure that for everyone in more than one opportunity has a safe environment here as well. So our anti-racism is about being accepting, including, and inclusive and respecting all people. So again, these are foundations of the actions that we engage with. It also led to an EDI strategy as well. So we're making sure, as I said, that our institution attempts to be inclusive, and all that is overlaid across many of those actions. So again, most of our actions are rights-based understandings. They're intersectional. They talk about truth-telling. They talk about healing. It's all about strength-based process. So we don't just talk about individuals or actions as in we're supporting the victims. We're actually talking about the strengths that live within our communities and engaging with those strengths. And it's all a very continuous process. It also is about stopping and reflecting and asking people to reflect in their everyday actions, in their curriculum, in their research relationships, and trying to learn from those processes. So we've tried to build on those things within this institution.
Beautifully said. So just taking a First Nations principle lens, cultural safety lens, community lens, and building it into more broader diversity, equity, inclusion strategies. So, and just noting the similarity between La Trobe and RMIT is that your work at both universities started well and truly before the Human Rights Commission's report came out. So it's a wonderful, generous thing that you're doing to give us some of your hindsight. So thank you, Michael, and I'll move to Alec. Same question for you, what was that moment? And you're, just to share with the audience, RMIT is wonderfully on the brink of kind of launching your RMIT anti-racism strategy. It's been through University Council, it's been through you as a key sponsor of change, and then all of your executives. So it's a wonderful moment in time to share best practice. So Alec, what was that moment?
Look, it's probably a couple of moments, but I'll draw attention to them, Div. Certainly when I arrived at RMIT, here's a university which has very strongly stated values with regard to inclusivity, Indigenous respect and reconciliation, in some sense, zero tolerance for any actions which are, where we discriminate against people on race or religion and so forth. So in some sense, my arrival here, in some sense, I took that at face value and accepted the fact that we are, pretty well, we've got racism and intolerance under control. I think a couple of things have happened along the pathway. One has been, to be quite frank, that what has flown from Gaza, which has been a burgeoning of, quite clear anti-Semitic behaviour, which I only appreciated fully via meetings with Jewish staff and students and their personal experiences. And then that was compounded by the Human Rights Commission survey, which, we were ahead of that survey because we could see this coming. But in some sense, the thing that was most, gave rise to my epiphany to a large extent was this sense that clearly there is racism here on our campus, despite the fact that, I had not previously been aware of it. And I accept the fact that, I think one of the things of being in a position of hierarchy in a university is people tend to behave well in my presence. So I actually see no one comes and explicitly makes racist comments, in my presence. But, what clearly, I think just having those conversations with staff who were feeling, the lack of respect on the basis of their race or religion. And as I said, it started very much, and for me with the Jewish staff and students, but expanded beyond that with all the anecdotes that we received from the report of the Commission, which showed in some sense that we were failing against what I see as a fundamental value for us, which is providing a safe and inclusive environment for our staff and students and community. And it's that, I suppose, as I said, until then I had been able to be reasonably naive about, these actions, because as I said, a lot of them are not explicit and they're not done, in the presence or in a public view. They're done, I think the terminology has been, referred to as microaggressions in some sense, the clear disrespect which is intended, but is almost in some sense just directed from, the antagonist towards the victim, in settings where, in some sense people are shunned because of their race, their religion, their background, and opportunities are not extended to them. So For me, it's pretty fundamental. This is important for us because it's a fundamental value for us. And, the only way for us to do that is to go about it in a systemic and cross-institutional priority. And that's the reason that we are working with you and others and certainly staff internally to bring that about. And my role then becomes very much one of, how do we make that very visible? How do we bring it to the attention of the council and the community more generally?
Yeah. You've been a wonderful bridge builder between the University Council, your staff, your students, your leaders, and just to recognise it, especially for the audience, RMIT's anti-racism plan has a real strong intersectional component with race, faith, religion, and while Alec references engaging with the Jewish community, he is also equally engaged with the Muslim communities and all other communities that experience racism. So what stuck out for me with Alec's engagement was that he, as a sponsor, said, I'm not waiting for prevalence. I'm not waiting for more and more experiences. Now we must respond. So I think that's a beautiful stance to take, not to wait for more anecdotes of racial slurs, because we know that it often doesn't materialize like that. It might be structural, systemic, or very covert or microaggressive. So thank you, Alec. I'll move to you, Michael, and this is a bit of a provocation because I like to keep you on your toes for sure. We know that there's been some starts across universities with working with First Nations, reconciliation and doing all of that good work. And sometimes there's tension between the fact that there's not enough progress for First Nations people by any stretch of the imagination, anywhere in any private or public sector organization. And then there's this broad anti-racism action planning or discourse. And sometimes some communities say, not enough for us yet, or some communities saying there's a hyper focus on certain communities and not enough across all communities. And there's that tension. What would you say to the fact that, we have senior leaders on the call who might be stuck in that tension where they actually have to launch an anti-racism action plan or strategy, and some people might feel this is diluting the effort for certain communities? What would you say?
I think when it comes to any level of discrimination at all, there is no greater weighted form of discrimination. Okay, it affects the individuals very, very personally, and it's quite a painful effect. So again, it can be quite emotionally and almost physically demanding on that individual to try to deal with that occurring around them. And sometimes it can be very obvious conflict where people are being challenged directly. Sometimes it can just be the institution not with their everyday business, just really ignoring the diversity that belongs within its institution. So again, it can be part of that. So again, any form, you need to really kind of think about dealing with this difference. And it's not an easy box ticking exercise. It takes a lot of experience and understanding. And sometimes it can be really traumatizing to certain individuals, where other individuals may say, just water on a duck's back, it's just everyday business. And again, it depends on the community, it depends on the individuals of how they've had their own lived experience as well. So again, no matter what, there is no one easy one, there is no no aspect of racism that is prioritised over any other levels. So again, that becomes really difficult. And again, it's about one of the examples from the research was, they talked about 81% of Aboriginal people talking about being affected by racism every day. Only 6% of that population did make any complaints about it. So in some ways, maybe because as I highlighted that very long history, they've kind of carried, the system may not consider them and their trauma as well. So it is a really difficult thing. And again, because of that, trauma can be intergenerational as well. So again, it may, it may occur through a conflict, but that history that's been carried by that family will build it to quite a point. So again, those considerations needs to be understood by everyone. And again, understood, not just that you don't do that, but again, if someone's affected, that having a quiet little conversation with someone in the back of a classroom might be a start, but it's not going to deal with all that ongoing So again, people need to consider that. So institutions need to really consider that it's not a one-off little simple answer. It needs to be thought about and developed over a very long time. And again, it's that idea of when things do occur, try to open up and talk about it, engage with that. Ask senior leaders, ask the people involved, talk to the students, talk to the staff, allow everyone the opportunity to talk about it, and institutions to note it, engage with it, take some time to reflect on it, and think about how we as an institution can build, and then take those actions. So, that really quick fix probably isn't the best fix.
Yeah.
But time is always a difficult tool to play with.
Yeah. So I'm going to sort of jump in there and say, taking an anti-racism stance isn't leaving anyone behind. It's an anti-racism strategy or plan is inclusive of everybody who experiences racism, and that's noting how it manifests, where it manifests, with who it manifests, and being inclusive of everyone. So I think that's important. Yeah.
Racism is felt by the individual.
Yeah.
Not about the other saying, well, no, that's not really racist.
Yeah.
If it's felt to be racism, then it is racism. And that needs to be understood as well.
Perfect. Mic drop moment. Thank you, Michael. Alec, I'll turn to you and really put your hat on of executive sponsor and tell us, what does it actually look like in practice? Or almost like walk us through the activities of what you did. You were our megaphone inside RMIT, if I can call you that. What does that look like in practice? How did you do it?
Look, I think the reality is, and I'm sure this is the case at most institutions, there are people who are already probably employed in the people and culture area who are, seeking to provide safe, inclusive workplaces, right? So we've got people who are experts on inclusivity, experts on, in some sense, we all have policies which show zero tolerance for racism and discrimination. Despite that, of course, the reality is, that's not uniformly the case, and we've got plenty of staff and students who put their hands up in a survey and said, well, I'm not getting the benefits from that. I'm still feeling racism, and Michael's obviously attested to that as well. And so from my point of view, it's then a question of saying, I'm not the expert in this space, but we have people who are the experts, and my role effectively is to liberate them to speak up and take ownership and take action here, right? And that's what I'm seeing. I mean, as you're aware, it's not me directly in terms of the person who is leading the definition and implementation of this plan. That happens at a level and two below me. But we have great people. The big difference between now and I would argue previously is they hadn't been empowered to fully implement these approaches and these strategies. So it is a question of taking leadership in terms of stating our values, connecting them to where we are not meeting our values, and making sure that people understand up to and including our council, but also across the university, that actually the people who are leading in this space have my full authority and support to implement the changes that we need to see to be the university that we want to be, right? So that's I suppose that's the best way to, for me, leadership looks like, appointing good people and empowering them to get on and do the job, and empowering people who are not just good people, but they're good people who have expertise in the field in which they're, and know, on the basis of past practice and evidence what works, and obviously engaging people like yourself, Div, to assist with that.
You've done a beautiful job in, I feel like you're underselling a little bit there, Alec, in terms of you've done a beautiful job in not standing in anyone's way. So effectively, that's what you've said in that answer. I mean, you just gave that authorizing environment to people to lead. And sometimes we do encounter senior leaders and VCs who actually are worried about the outcome of how it is implemented, and worried about all that stakeholder management. And I'm more worried about the reputational damage to the university, and then actually become roadblocks and barriers in practitioners' ways. So I would say both Michael and you have actually been really open, really curious, coming with no prejudgment, and giving a full authorizing environment, which is a really good executive sponsor sort of view from our end. So Thank you for that.
No, thanks, Div. And for me, once again, I continually say this, it does go back to values. It does go back to what we stand for. And look, if we receive a report, which identifies shortcomings, as the Human Rights Commission report does, right? Then, we could try and talk those away. We could try and talk those down. But the reality is that's not actually living up to our values. Living up to our values, it's not concern. My concern isn't about in the short term how this is perceived externally. It's about us, in some sense, being very open with the improvements that we want to make. As I said, to be the university, to stand up to what we were established to be. So it's not a question of saying, well, how do we make this look less bad? It's a question of how do we get on the front foot and say this is how we're dealing with it. And yes, we aren't happy with where we are, but we're aspiring to be in a better place.
Excellent. We've got a question from the audience. So I do have my closing question, which is I want you to give advice to leaders in the audience. But before I get to that, and so I'll cut down on time a little bit, but there's a question online about considering the recent outcomes of the Anti-Semitism Universities Review, talk about potentially how absorbing it's perceived that anti-Semitism is being absorbed into policies on racism. So I'll leave it there and see who's first to the talking stick. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm quite happy to make a comment. Again, it was, as you brought up that earlier question about the tensions of, which is, and again, sometimes as an Aboriginal man in Australia, I was kind of thinking, there's a lot of really quick change occurring over a series of incidents. And I was thinking, this is again, not completely surprising, but it's kind of concerning. But I was able to, again, stop and reflect. I did take that time to listen to my own advice, and I reflected. And again, I like I feel it's very important that, as I said earlier, there is racism within our society, and allowing people to stop and reflect on not just you, but what's happening around you is a really important value, as Alec also highlighted. And it's important to engage with that, to stop and think, well, yes, we can do more if we take all these considerations into our actions and take it that way as well. And again, for me, it's not just one issue. It's about us as a society making those steps forward.
So I'll just stay with you, Michael, and then I'll throw to you to close, Alec. But Michael, if you had to think about one good piece of advice to give to a VC or senior executive at a university in the audience now, what would be that gold advice about starting or continuing on the anti-racism journey? And I'll ask the same with you, Alec. So go ahead, Michael.
Absolutely, take time. I know there is, it needs to be dealt with, particularly when it comes to brand and reputation. It needs to be done, but you need to take time, and it means don't just walk into, you've got to identify a position, ask their advice, and then run off with an answer. Take time, talk to your staff, talk to your students, engage with your stakeholders and your community, and then sit and then kind of engage with it, have a good listen to what others have said, reflect on it, re-engage about this is what we're thinking, and then work in partnership to work out, are these actions going to support and benefit us all?
Thank you, Michael. Over to you, Alec, if you want to comment on whether are we really absorbing anti-Semitism into the broad anti-racism bucket or not? And then,
well, I suppose in my sense, sorry, Div. I mean, I'm concerned when people want to try and create a hierarchy here of discriminations. Right? My sense is, as far as I'm concerned, discrimination on the basis of race or religion is wrong. We have zero tolerance for us. We don't think in some sense that one form of discrimination is not as serious as another form of discrimination. We wish to identify and remove, all racism. Now, I mean, that might be an overly ambitious target, but at the end of the day, that's what we're proceeding down that path. So I think the advice I'd give to people is in some sense not being trapped by, well, we can't do this for all cases at the moment because some are different, so we're not going to do it with any, right? And never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. always seek the opportunity to make progress. And I'm not saying that we should say, well, we can't deal with a particular form of racism. My sense is we should be able to deal with them all. But I think the idea of trying to manage relativity between different groups in terms of racist behaviour, I don't think is helpful. And I think, the other thing I'd say, which Michael said, for me, the thing that's been most, I suppose painful to experience, but at the same time most impactful for me, have been those conversations with staff and students who felt discriminated against. And in some sense, while I may not be able to rub out their past experience of having been discriminated against, I think feeling that they actually have, a set of ears at the most senior level, which is prepared to sit and give them time and hear their concern and express my I suppose upset and disappointment where the university has let them down, then my sense is that I think that's, I'm not saying it's completely remedial, but it's cathartic to a large extent to recognise actually the university is listening. And then, of course, we've got to follow that up and we've got to implement it and we've got to actually demonstrate the progress that we intend to make.
Yeah, beautifully said. I feel like it's an and conversation. It doesn't mean that if we have an anti-racism strategy, it doesn't mean we don't have to have a supportive solution for First Nations people, for people from a Muslim background or people from a Jewish background. It doesn't mean we have to have nothing that's very bespoke or tailored or addressing specific concerns. So the anti-racism strategy provides governance. So thank you both. You are both incredible leaders in your own right. You've given generously, personally and professionally to the space. So we're really lucky to have your voices as part of this conversation. Thank you. We'll move to panel, but you're welcome to stay. I know you're very busy people. So I'll let you go if you need to. But thank you very much for your generosity.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Beautiful. We'll move to the panel now, and I hope you're keeping your fingers light on Menti. It might have been a very warm conversation that drew you in, no doubt. Michael and Alec can be very engaging, and I'd like to welcome now more engaging people who are really the operational levers of change in their universities. So Tara, Steffi, and Lana. So we've got RMIT continuing the conversation from Alec. Stashi and I are from University of Melbourne and Alana Cam from Western Sydney University. So welcome to this panel discussion, and to the audience where I'm watching to my left to look at the screen that holds the Mentimeter questions, and as you can see, I've built in one already into that discussion. I'm quite open to doing the same with the panel, so please keep your questions coming through. I'll kick off first really to all of the panelists just to ask that opening question and give us a sense from your lens, whether it's a professional lens, and of course not on behalf of your universities necessarily, but as professionals in the space. I'd love you to introduce yourself and just make some opening remarks about the maturity of anti-racism efforts as you see it in the higher ed sector. So I'll throw to you quickly, Tara, because you've had your wonderful VC open up the conversation on RMIT. So please introduce yourself from a professional point, because I think the audience will connect with each of your backgrounds, and then kick into some commentary for us.
Sure. Thanks, Div, and thanks for having me today too. So my name's Tara Waller, and my role at RMIT is the Director of Capability and Employee Experience. And so my remit includes anti-racism and inclusion, diversity, equity, and access more broadly at RMIT. And I guess the question around racism and our maturity as a sector, I spent a really long time thinking about this one, Div. It's a great question. And I think the initial thing that came up for me was racism doesn't start and end at university campuses. And so it's really hard for me to think about our maturity without thinking about how we fit into the broader ecosystem. And I think Michael worded it perfectly in saying Australia is a racist country. And so how do we as institutions tackle racism and build our maturity in that context? And so the issue's bigger than us, but it's also part of us. And so the biggest question that I think, can ask ourselves as universities is how do we then be part of that solution for our sector, but then more broadly for Australia? And RMIT have started that, but I think our exec would say, and I think you heard our Vice Chancellor say early, that we have a long way to go with our maturity. You know, we're a work in progress at RMIT, and I don't think that we're alone in that in the sector. So we're all at different places, and so my struggle when I think about where we're at in maturity is, even if I think about us as an institution, let alone sector, there are different levels of maturity in all different sections of RMIT. And I think we have examples of what's working. And for me, that's when we move into systems. And I'm sure that I'll talk more to that later. But that's the big difference in maturity for me, is when we start moving from recognizing that we have interpersonal racism, which is important and needs to be addressed and is critical, and start saying, what are the systems and processes and policies and frameworks that we have in place that we can dismantle or rethink, or at least reassess, so that we can start moving our maturity forward. So I guess my short answer would be, we're having conversations in sector. I don't hear those conversations happening a lot outside of sector, and so I'm kind to us in a lot of forums, because I think that means that we're at least going somewhere that most of the country, I don't think, has been courageous enough to step into. And I think in some ways that means we're primed to lead as a sector, and we can really generate change across our nation. And I'd balance that by saying, as we've heard today, that we're also a pretty long way from where we need to be.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for that recognition of movement from interpersonal into institutional structural, right? That's a big move. Just to even say those words out loud is fantastic. As an anti-racism practitioner, that's awesome. Thank you, Tara. I'll throw to you. It's actually same question. You know, just introduce yourself and opening remarks on maturity. Where are we?
Yeah, thanks so much, Div. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, as you said, I'm Senior Advisor Anti-Racism. I work in the Office of the Provost at the University of Melbourne. I live on Jara country and work on Wurundjeri country. I came to this work in a pretty roundabout kind of way from a previous life as an academic, after spending some time working in local government. So the University of Melbourne, I guess, in some ways has progressed a little bit down the path of maturity in terms of anti-racism work. Although I think when you position that in relation to our history as an institution, we still have a very long way to go, and we've only progressed kind of a tiny percentage of how far we need to go. Our anti-racism action plan was developed in 2024, launched in August of that year as a companion document to Murrumbidgee, which is our Indigenous strategy. And it was pretty amazing to arrive at a university at the beginning of 2025 where such significant work was being done to fully understand the racism built into the very foundations of an institution that was established in 1854, and in the process of that establishment took land and knowledge out of the hands of the traditional owners, out of the hands of the Wurundjeri people. By the time our AHRC launched, there had already been significant investment in and commitment to the implementation of Murrumbidgee. So we were in a good position to hit the ground running, particularly when it came to delivering on the first two pillars of our AHRC, which are acknowledge racism and understand racism. And I think significant progress has been made in the last kind of almost 2 years. So there are shifts in the conversation. There's a much wider acknowledgement that racism is a problem for us. And the sector as a whole. Increased respect for Indigenous knowledges, and in particular schools and faculties, but as Tara said, different parts of the university are responding in different ways. There's significant investment in truth-telling and justice initiatives, and in-person racial literacy education, and student co-design and consultation have already also been high on our agenda. But the development of our understanding of the depth of the problem also reveals how much there is to be done. The more we do, the more we see what needs to be done. And so in a lot of ways, I think the Respect at Uni report kind of told us what we already know. The numbers of people who experience direct racism at uni, the numbers who feel unsafe, the particular marginalisation of certain communities. And we've made good progress in a number of areas that were flagged in the report, particularly in the development of strategy, action plan, governance, annual reporting, education programs. But I think data collection.
I'll just interject there, Sashi. I'll just pick that up. Actually, I've got a question for you on that implementation, which you're talking to now, which is brilliant. Let's throw to Alana and bring her into the conversation. So Alana, introduce yourself, please, to the audience and just let us know what you think of maturity, higher ed sector, anti-racism. Where are we?
Thanks, Div. So unlike the other people who have spoken today, I'm a researcher in this space rather than university leadership. So I'm senior lecturer.
I question that. I reckon you're still a leader, right?
Thank you.
You're an extraordinary leader. Yeah.
So I'm senior lecturer in the School of Social Sciences here at Western, zooming in from Burramattagal country, the land of the eel. I'm also a researcher on the Challenging Racism project here at Western, and also the Centre of Resilient and Inclusive Societies, which is a consortium funded by the Victorian government. So some cross-state pollination going on there. So for around 2 decades, I've been doing research on the experiences of racism, as well as community attitudes, and with my colleagues in the CRP and Chris, developing and testing anti-racism interventions across sectors. So from schools, government departments, across the board. So I feel like I'm just going to repeat much of what's already been said. The Racism at Uni findings, unfortunately for racism scholars like myself, are not surprising, but they are still deeply concerning, probably more concerning because they're not surprising. And, as others have said, universities pride ourselves on being these progressive spaces, but the data has shown that we are actually reflecting what's happening in broader society. Tara, you mentioned that earlier. So when we view the Racism at Uni report in tandem with research that, we're doing in the CRP and across other institutions across the country, racism in other contexts, again, as Tara said, it's not isolated to university. Yeah. It's across the board. So in terms of Western, we're quite unique as a university in Australia. Equity and diversity is part of our DNA. I know that sounds really cliche, but it's true, because we are servicing Western Sydney. And if anyone knows Western Sydney, they know how diverse it is. Yeah. And, for example, 2/3 of our students are first in their family to ever go to university. That's extremely unique across the sector. We have the largest number of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and non-English speaking backgrounds, again, in Australia. Over 3% of our students are Indigenous. And of course, our staff also contribute that amazing diversity that is Western Sydney Uni. We also house, of course, the Challenging Racism project, which I'm part of, which is, deeply embedded in the Western Sydney context, but also looking at Australia more broadly. Other things that we're doing at Western, the RMIT and La Trobe have mentioned Indigenous strategies. We also have, some sector-leading Indigenous strategies where truth-telling is absolutely key. And we proactively acknowledge racism and move towards an anti-racist future, as others have said, through programming. And an example I want to give, which I think is, we've mentioned that a lot of this stuff is really difficult to do. One thing.
Sorry, Alana, could you hold on that? Could you hold on that?
I'll talk about it later.
Yeah, I'll move it into questions, right? And I might just, because I'm managing time, I'll just throw to Sashi and then Tara and then back to you, Alana. So Sashi, you started us sort of imagining where UniMelb is at this point in time, and I love that you use that framing. So when we talk about anti-racism, we talk about acknowledge, understand, respond, prevent. So you're on a journey with that. So, share how you feel, the audience needs to think about phasing and implementation, because we've already painted the picture of where we are as a society and then how universities fit in there as a microcosm of society. So there's always going to be movement and a long way to go. But the phasing is so important. And sometimes people, because of the urgency, definitely the lived experience of racism, I know we want it urgently and we want it now and we wanted it last generation kind of thing. So how did you cope with producing the phasing, communicating the phasing? How did the university receive a phased approach? And how can you talk to us about the pacing of the work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Div. So I think I'll start by saying a little bit about the initial phase of developing the ARAP and how that kind of shifted into implementation and the kind of governance structures that allow us to maintain momentum in this work, which is so slow in a lot of ways. So developing an ARAP at an institution that's so large and with such diverse issues and needs across the different faculties and departments was a huge challenge. And the development of the plan itself raised a lot of awareness as to the kinds of racism that were most frequently experienced at the university, and mostly everyday racism or microaggressions, although there are plenty of examples of overt racism as well. So, but that initial kind of attention obviously drops away over time. The development of the AHRC was supported by research conducted by MindTribes, by yourselves, and by the Racism at UOM reports produced annually by AMSU, our student union. And the writing of the plan was overseen by a steering group made up of subject matter and lived experience experts from across the university that included student reps. So once the AHRC had been launched, the steering group became the AHRC Implementation Working Group. And it's one of two governance groups. The other one is the Addressing Everyday Racism's Working Group. And these groups and all accountable leaders across the university for all the actions in the AHRC all report to the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Subcommittee, which is a committee of the university executive. So it's really important to have this kind of really senior kind of leadership input into the ongoing kind of implementation of the plan.
I'll jump in there. Any pushback to this phasing is too slow, or?
There's pushback in both directions, actually. Accountable leaders in some areas find that the expectations are too high because of those kind of systemic and structural changes that need to be made and how embedded those structures are. And students would love to see change happening a lot more quickly. And often it's a communications issue that we're not actually getting the message out about what's actually happening. And, genuinely kind of shifting the culture is slow work, really, because in many ways we're working against a wider cultural tide and trying to shift systems that might seem kind of benign but perpetuate racism or may not address racism in ways that are culturally appropriate or that improve trust in the university. We have learned that we need to keep gathering information because priorities kind of shift year to year and the priorities kind of change depending on the community and what's happening outside of the university as well as inside the university. But also gathering data can be difficult because, there are so many surveys and survey fatigue is a real thing and the changes are incremental. So the community can feel like we're just taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I think something that we found really useful is anti-racism initiatives themselves that really engage the university population and are supported by senior leaders and funded for delivery across the whole of the university. That can make a really big difference. So, for example, the Critical Conversations Racial Literacy Education Program has been delivered and continues to be delivered by academics from our anti-racism hallmark research initiative here at the university, and they're also members of our Addressing Everyday Racism's Working Group, and that's the group that has oversight of this project. And this is a 2-hour in-person session that has now been delivered to cohorts in all faculties and some professional teams. And it allows participants to reflect on what racism is, what it truly means to be racially literate. It uses the idea of cultural humility to invite participants to reflect on their own positionality and capacity to make change. And I think the beauty of this program has been that facilitators went to each faculty or team and discussed what they wanted to get out of the program and then adapted it accordingly. And each faculty also identified who would participate. And so feedback is being collected as this program kind of rolls out, and then an evaluation report is produced. On the back of this, a train the facilitator model is now being piloted in 2 faculties with more to come so that it can be delivered into the future. And I think the great thing about that is then we have the data to support the ongoing kind of funding of this work and it, might incrementally shift the culture. We still can't get everybody to turn up, but we've got data there to support its ongoing kind of implementation.
I love that you're stepping into that, acknowledge, understand. Sometimes it's not linear, like you got to keep going back and forth and agitating for that. And actually over time you'll see movement. But I just love that you painted that picture of consistency and progression, and sometimes it's messy and you feel like you're standing still but you're actually moving forward. So thank you for that, leading us into the culture change question, because I wanted to ask Tara the same thing. How have you connected anti-racism work into culture change and transformational culture change within RMIT, because you're at that precipice now of kind of getting into the stage where Sashi is about sharing, learning, understanding. So how have you connected the two? Because you're in that comms stage. Tara, for the audience, is a beautiful comms person. She's a person who's like bringing all the stakeholders along behind the scenes and making it work, which is, hard work, but is necessary. So yeah, how have you connected that with those stakeholders?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I was listening to Sashi and I was incredibly jealous of where you've got to, Sashi. So
we're all getting there.
It's all perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the reality is, when I think about anti-racism as one of the pillars of culture, or inclusion as one of the pillars of culture, I think that's how we've needed to kind of change things. And we are, as I mentioned before, a work in progress. But one of the reasons I joined RMIT is because of our commitment to inclusion. And you heard our Vice Chancellor talk to that earlier. It is similar to what you said, Alana. It is part of our DNA. And so I actually joined the organisation when we were building one of the cornerstones that have now enabled anti-racism for us in our IDEA framework. And we love an acronym that for us stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. But there are some critical pillars that sit within that have helped us to look at both the structures and then how we build the culture. And so they are access, participation, and success. So when we're thinking about that through an anti-racism lens, who gets into our university, either as a student or a staff member? How are we supporting our people to succeed? Who are we celebrating, and what does that look like? With education and research is another pillar. So what is our pedagogy? How are we ensuring that we're decolonizing that we have different racial perspectives and histories in the teaching that we do and the research that we support? What's our capability and leadership, and what's the accountability that our leaders have to drive that? Who do we partner with? And what's our infrastructure and services? So the IDEA framework really sets what that foundation is for us. And then it's really easy to say, and then we've solved it. But as you would know, that's not true. So the way we've then made that part of our culture is by really leaning into some of our early adopters. And similar to what Sashi talked about, we had a program that we partnered with experts on around courageous conversations about race. So people who are ready to equip themselves with the right tools to have the right conversations about race, we brought into a room together and gave them tools to do that with. And they've become some of our biggest champions for what anti-racism looks like at RMIT, and really driving some of those structures and systems that I talked to. And then I think the pieces that we've learned the most about are, how are we amplifying the right voices? So when I talk about access and success, who's in the room and who's not in the room, and who needs to be in the room? Because I come to this work, I'm very aware that I'm a white person who comes with a certain amount of privilege to a conversation about anti-racism. I know that that's true, and I know that my voice is not always the voice that people need to hear. And through working with you, Div, I now know that sometimes my voice is exactly the voice that people need to hear, and I need to step up and own that. And so that's an important learning that I think we have as individuals, but also as institutions, to lean into.
Beautifully said, Tara. I'm just going to hold you there because you talked beautifully about enacting that change activation, like through the champions. But I'm just managing time. I want to get to Alana, and you had a story that you were just going to share with us. So maybe share that, Alana, in context of your research brain and perspective, and what challenges and opportunities that poses for progress in anti-racism. But absolutely share your story. And I'm going to ask you also to manage time, and I'll switch back to, I've got a clock watching there for Sashi. She's got a very important meeting to head to, so I'm watching that. But go ahead, Alana.
Yeah, so I was actually going to, it fits in very well with what Tara was just talking about in terms of culture change.
Yeah.
And the example I was going to give on something that is relatively easy to do in this space, and I say that with a caveat, is, shifting away from Harmony Day to the formal recognition of the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Because one of the key barriers to doing this work in university is the embeddedness of racism in our Australian culture, history, etc. And Alec mentioned that earlier on, and Tara, you're alluding to that, and Sashi as well. So, having that culture shift, having those discourse shifts to actually acknowledge the coloniality, not only of our country, but of our institutions. Universities are colonial institutions and continue to be until we have that reckoning and until we start having those discourse shifts. So something like shifting away from Harmony Day is really, really important. And we know, from the research, the university report, plus all the other research that's being done in this space across other contexts, that the groups that are being targeted and affected by racism are those which it's linked to our coloniality and our colonial history. So we really need to shift the narrative there. Other barriers that, I think are really important for us to address is that denial. Again, that's very linked to our history of colonisation, the denial and downplaying of the very existence of racism. So again, we need to build that knowledge. We need to have those education systems in place. And we also know through our research that there are particular demographics who are more likely to deny the existence of racism. It's no surprise who those people are. But to put a nicer spin on it, younger Australians and females are more likely to acknowledge racism. We're more likely to acknowledge, I say we because I put myself in that category.
Young and women, female.
We're more likely to acknowledge Anglo privilege and Indigenous discrimination, and we're also more willing to acknowledge our own prejudices. So how can we work with that knowledge to build allyship and to build, further education? And then with that comes the backlash and the resistance when, things are being implemented. And Tara and Sashi, I'm sure you've come across some backlash and resistance, which is really unfortunate. But again, our research shows who are the people who are most likely to resist. And so
Can I pick that up? Because that's my last question to both of you, but I'm going to actually pull that resistance and risk question to Sashi, because a lot of our ways in as practitioners is to connect racism experience as a psychosocial hazard and a risk, right? And that's a lovely way in, but sometimes doesn't get us all the way, right? And there's the resistance, when you're trying to disrupt something, especially systemic, institutional racism, you get resistance. So Sashi, can you make some closing comments? And I know that you have to go in 2 minutes, but if you could give us a sense of what that feels like to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think a challenge of our work has been to make it clear that racism is about more than just a handful of racist individuals, as everybody has kind of mentioned, and that it's so much easier to kind of coach people on how to approach and respond to racism if we position it as something perpetrated by a single individual, and which impacts a single individual, but that doesn't actually deal with the fundamental problem. And as you say, racism causes significant psychosocial harm. It prevents people from meeting their full potential, from feeling safe, from fully participating academically and socially in university life. It sends messages about who has the right to take up space and who doesn't. And we keep putting those messages out there, but, not everybody picks them up. And it's so important then, as Michael said in the first part of this session, to not just frame this in the negative. And our online training modules, critical conversation, student co-design are very focused on the value of cultural diversity. In a university setting in particular, an anti-racist culture should be something we all kind of aspire to. It broadens perspectives, it introduces new knowledge systems and ways of seeing the world. And I think alongside the framework of psychosocial risk, it kind of adds impetus to the urgent need to prevent racism and not just kind of respond to it. And it can be really productive to focus on systems and not kind of individuals. So we had a student co-design project to develop guidelines to address racism in teaching and learning settings. And these students who worked in this space, and they were paid for their time, and they all had lived experience, and they got a lot out of it, as well as us getting a lot out of it from their expertise. They flagged very early on that that psychosocial harm that is the result of kind of tutors and other students avoiding pronouncing unfamiliar sounding names, for example. So students less likely to be called upon, have fewer opportunities to make contributions, and may feel self-conscious if they're asked for a nickname or an English name. And they came up with pretty simple solutions, like it's okay to ask, but they were thinking about solutions and thinking about kind of positive and proactive ways to be in the classroom. And at the same time, and kind of unbeknownst to us at the time, an online resource was being developed in the Asia Institute to support staff to learn how to pronounce non-anglicised names. So we now have the opportunity to link these two resources and ensure that more students feel included. And on one level, it just doesn't matter whether everyone agrees that not calling students by their name can be racism, because the work that's being done promotes inclusion and improves psychosocial safety regardless. So I think having that really kind of positive approach, as well as the kind of more complaints-based, punitive, kind of negative approach, which is also necessary in some instances, has been really productive for us. And the resistance is still there. There are still people who believe that racism isn't a problem for us, but I think that cultural shift, we can see that now at the same time. So that's really positive, I think.
Thank you so much for your voice in this space, Safi. You're someone who comes with both lived experience and research, a research brain, and then an activator of change. So thank you, Safi. You've given us a wonderful arc of progress. And I reckon everybody's listening going, well, where are we in that arc? So thank you for shaping it so nicely for us. And if you have to pop off, please do. And I'll stay with Tara and Alana and ask you the same question. You know, what is it like to have this conversation, knowing that you're going to face into resistance? And Alana, you gave us a really good insight of who are the resistors and who are the adopters of change, and that's interesting to note and not surprising either. But yeah, how do you face into the resistance, but also how do you reframe that this is not only about a risk conversation, it's also about a valuing of cultural strength conversation as well, you know. So I'll throw to you, Alana, because you talked very poignantly about those demographics, you know, what you find in your research, and tell us what you think.
Yeah, I think there is no denying. I don't want to take away the fact that racism is a psychosocial risk.
Yeah.
We have, oodles and oodles of research, what we call the morbid effects of racism. And I led a project during the pandemic on Asian Australians' experiences of racism at that time. And the data was clear as day, the link between experiencing racism and poor mental health, well-being and sense of belonging. I do want to point out, which I think is very important, is that you don't actually have to experience racism directly for it to have those morbid effects. Yeah. So many of the participants in that project, and there was over 2,000 of them, said that they anticipated racism, that they feared going to particular places, that it was having effects on their mental health and well-being. So that's something we also need to think about when we're building these strategies and looking at who is being affected, because it has a far broader reach than what we think. And I think in terms of just framing racism as a psychosocial risk, it takes away the fact that racism has far-reaching effects in terms of mobility, access to resources, therefore your ability to have progression, whether that's at university as a staff or student, or to succeed in your life outcomes more broadly. And I think, Tara, you mentioned earlier about the cumulative effects of racism. It doesn't just stop at the university gates. You may then experience it on public transport on your way home, when you're trying to rent a house, when you're having interactions with the police. So we need to understand the complex and nuanced way in which racism operates and the impacts that it has on people in order for us to develop really bespoke, meaningful and impactful anti-racism strategies.
Beautifully said. And I love, unfortunately, dishearteningly, is you don't have to just experience it. I just caught myself in my own lived experience there, Alana, when you said that I actually anticipate that I might experience racism, and then I notice I moderate it. I even moderate my children as to how to manage themselves in a space, not too loud.
It's devastating. It's devastating because it limits your opportunities in life and your abilities to succeed. Yeah, absolutely devastating.
What about you, Tara? How have you been framing this, and how you've been dealing with resistance, and how are you framing it with that risk lens or not? I don't know how you're doing it.
No, a risk lens is certainly one of the lenses that we have looked at our work through. And so the connection to psychosocial risks is clear, and it's often one that's a useful hook. You know, one of the things that we know works is by linking this work with things that people already care about or already thinking about. And so understanding the impact of racism on psychosocial wellbeing, mental wellbeing is one of those things. But for us, as I think, you know, we started by saying, well, is that the right framing for us to look at our commitment statement and our action plan through? And fortunately for us, our exec sponsors said, no, it's absolutely critical and something we need to think about, but it's not our why. Our why is because we fundamentally want to be an anti-racist institution. And so psychosocial risk then became one of the things that we want to measure and address and work on, not the core of why we're doing the work that we're doing. And so that's been a really important thing for us. In terms of the backlash, one of the things that I found, and I'm very conscious that my experience is not everyone's, is that most of that backlash and resistance isn't coming from a place of malice, and a lot of the time it's coming from an unconscious incompetence. And so I think it speaks to the framework that Sashi's a bit further advanced with us at, and we're looking at around how do we support people to acknowledge and see the racism that is around them. Because for the majority of our people, the people that I've spoken to, it has been about, well, I haven't seen it, felt it, experienced it. No one's told me about it. Therefore, it is not a thing. And so how do we support people to be honest instead of performative about this stuff? So how can we really support them to say, actually, I've got no idea. I've never seen it. I don't know what to do. I don't know what it looks like, and have really honest conversations, meeting people where they are. Because the backlash most of the backlash we've had is when we've thrown a should at people. So the more we can pull away the should or the where are you or you're not far enough away, and have genuine, honest conversations with the right tools and the right information to have those tools, that's been where I think we've found the most impact. And so the more people who are equipped to have those conversations, the more we can shift the culture.
Yeah. I like how you frame that. And look, that denial can be malicious denial. It can be, I kind of know, but I want to say I don't know, you know. It's a nice safe space for me to land. But what we find is that actually just the continuous investment of racial literacy and the consistency of that is something that gets people, like noting that it's not going to go away. Like you've got a VC saying it, a university council saying it, senior lecturers saying it, researchers saying it, student staff talking about it. If we can keep the momentum high, just like how we've watched the gender equality movement in this country, we can do the same or replicate the same, because it's on a national discourse. It's, you know, we have the first anti-racism national strategy, we've got the Racism Uni report, that keeps it up, right? I've been waiting for a long time as a practitioner to see this crescendo moment, right? And that's what we have. We have a question from the audience there about how feasible do you think a sector-wide anti-racism capability program is really, you know, thinking about costs, thinking about consistent practice, all that leaders have to do, all that big capability uplift. So if we're saying racial literacy is kind of low, and we've got a way to go, like how feasible really is that? The university has a gazillion priorities and compliance, you know, obligations, etc. Like, what do you think?
I can jump in, and then Alana will have a different perspective as well. So, I mean, my view is it feasible? Yes. Is it easy? No. But we know that when universities collaborate really effectively, and I was privileged to be at a conference last week where our industrial relations across 38 universities were collaborating, we can do pretty incredible things when we work together. And I don't think that means that everything is uniform. I think that Western Sydney is going to have a really different set of issues and opportunities to what RMIT has, and then, you know, CQU will have a different bunch of challenges again. But we can align on principles, and we can align on commitment, and we can drive anti-racism forward, and with a whole lot of universities working together with that similar set of principles, I almost feel like we're the only way we can make change. So I feel like I'm being a bit Pollyanna, but But I think there are absolutely challenges with it. I think we're dealing with a lot of regulation that gets in the way sometimes of doing the really good work that we know we want to and can do. But I also think there's tremendous opportunity that's coming our way at the moment.
Yeah, I know. I like how you said, it's not easy, but it shouldn't detract us from doing hard things, and I love the communities of practice. One of the things that we want to do as an outcome of this webinar, and I'll say it because it's recorded, that we would love to build communities of practice. Like, I feel like we play that role in bringing our clients together and having conversations like this. I feel we can only learn from each other. Like, I've already learned from both of you quite quickly in this short time we have together. So I stand by that. I think if we come together on it, we make a louder sound together. Alana, what do you think? How feasible? You've got a wealth of knowledge as Western Sydney. Like, just sitting down with you, you'll learn a lot, Alana, from your research.
I completely agree with Tara. I think it is absolutely, well, this is me having no, experience at the executive level, but I would like to think that it's very feasible, but yet difficult. And I think having that collective momentum is very, very important. But as Tara said, each individual university will have to respond to their own context and own needs. I want to throw in, we in the anti-racism space, what we say is we need to set new norms. So, for example, that's why it's so important to call out racism, because when you're calling out racism, you're saying to that person or to that institution or, to that group that what you're saying is not acceptable, it's not okay, and it's not the norm. So I see that in terms of the collectivization of universities. If we collect and work together, we are setting new norms, we are setting new standards. So any university that is not coming on board, that is lagging behind, they're seen as the outlier, they're the outsider. So if we can frame it that way, again, I think we can do some really amazing things, learning from each other, absolutely.
Beautiful. I might add a little twist to an answer to this question to actually debunk the myth that we should always take a learning orientation to this from a capability uplift. Like, if the question asker is saying sector-wide anti-racism capability and costs, I would say actually I can debunk that, because actually the behavioral learning actually only addresses interpersonal racism, to be frank, right? What we would love leaders to do, which is something that we do, is actually address the structural institutional racism. So even if you take a student enrollment process, even if you take grants for PhDs as a process, and you run a racial equity impact assessment across those processes, and you think about, to all of you mentioned, who has access. Tara mentioned this as well, Sashi, too. Who has access? For example, I can say in one of our equity impact assessments with a large university, we found that grants for PhDs were only given for First Nations topics, were given largely to Anglo-Saxon females who were beautifully collaborating with First Nations communities, but disproportionately, we had about almost 90% of grants going to those Anglo-Saxon females. We didn't have First Nations women, First Nations men who were researchers receiving that funding to work with their own communities of choice, right? So we go, okay, actually, that's inequitable. We can't have that, right? And that needs to be disrupted. And we only found that out from an evidence base, from a leader who manages the grant funding rounds and PhD allocations, to understand the data that had been and the process and how exclusionary it was. So one of the key findings was that the fact that we asked for written submissions and we asked for all those things, and there could be a different way of attracting evidence as to why you would be eligible for that grant in a PhD. So changing that process actually incrementally improved the First Nations cohort of the next PhD grant recipients. So things like that, I do feel that a lot of leaders come to it with wanting to get to know the how, wanting to do something positive. And actually this behavioral sort of learning, even though I'm a behavioral psych myself, like just doing that learning, hours and hours of learning, which runs up the labor costs and hours of facilitation and pulling people away from their roles to deal with something that's not easy, but actually doing maybe a reduced number of hours to bring a process of theirs that they own to interrogate from a racial equity lens means everything, and then they're doing something and then they're watching it improve. And that governance and ownership of that process is theirs, so they're in control, right? So I feel like sometimes I would say to that question, let's not think about it only in behavioral learning, because that could be a sunk cost, probably 8 to 12 weeks after someone leaves the room. So I would challenge that. I'll squeeze in one more question to both of you, and there's two very similar ones about representation, and this goes to Watermark's exposure of the fact that we've dropped in cultural diversity on boards in general, and that would be probably very similar to the university sector. So the question is about how can we truly be anti-racist if we just don't have that lived experience in leadership, and how do we get that representation, especially at the executive layers? And I know there's no magic bullet to it, but what do you reckon will be the change? Do we have to wait 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to see it organically improve, or is there some reform that you're looking at universities or know of? Tara, what do you think? Any magic answers for that?
If we had magic answers, we'd have very different representation on our leadership.
For sure. I just need a wand.
No, we don't. We don't have magical answers, but also we don't need to wait 10 years. And so the reason I came off mute quickly is because it's kind of connected to what you were just talking about, Div. One of the things that we've implemented, I know most Victorian universities at a minimum have to do gender impact assessments, and we've extended that to include racial equity assessments and responsible practice, which is our First Peoples, our approach to how we ensure reconciliation and First Peoples self-determination. So as part of that, we've applied that to all of our leadership processes. So academic promotion, what does it look like if we apply a racial equity lens to who's getting promoted and what the criteria are and how inclusive they are? Our succession management processes from a people and culture perspective, any of our high potential programs, we make sure that we have equitable representation on those things. I regularly hear a term, if you can't be it, you can't see it. And I fundamentally want to prove that wrong, because somebody has to be it for other people to see it. And so I think my job, or what I want at RMIT, is for us to support people to be that person and to fundamentally shift what that representation is. And some of that also means fundamentally rethinking what good leadership looks like, because in so many of at least our structural contexts, we still think about leadership as kind of white male colonial versions of leadership, and that's not the only way that great leadership can look or be or feel. And so some of it's challenging what that structure is, and some of it's making sure that we've challenged all of the processes in place to get the right people into leadership.
Yeah, excellent. I'm so glad you're doing that equity impact assessment across people processes and talent management decisions. Those are excellent ways to kind of get people participating in the change, I reckon. Like, just participate as a hiring manager, see what happens. Anyway,
and hold them accountable for it.
Yeah. Oh, I like that the best. Anyway, Alana, what do you think? Representation, where are we? What do we do? Do targets work? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I over the last decade or so have done a lot of work with SBS, and in part of that work, I present to media agencies, brands, big corporations, and a lot of the questions they ask me is about representation, whether it's representation in their advertising or representation within their organizations. And, I always say to them, representation absolutely matters, because if people can't see themselves on a screen within their institution or organization, it's really harmful. And they believe that they therefore can't be, as you were saying, can't be that, can't succeed, etc. And I've done a lot of work on trust in institutions. And what we can also see is that if people aren't seeing themselves within institutions, it erodes their trust in that institution. And that is really, really damaging for society. Trust is a building block of a successful functioning society, socially, economically, and politically. So if we start seeing that erosion of trust in our universities, trust in our other institutions, government departments, that's where we see, shifts to extremist views, shift to misinformation, populist politics. So universities are such a core pillar of our society, of knowledge production, of leadership. We really need to have that representation in order to ensure that trust, and just that we're building, critically minded, forward-thinking individuals in our staff and our students.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the only caveat I'd put to that is make sure that those appointments are made with care, safety, and for the person to be set up to thrive, right? Coming from being South African born and watching affirmative action targets not land well, and then people actually suffering complete career setbacks because this became their professional brand, right? That they failed at that first senior exec role. What we know of is that people from marginalized backgrounds often only last 18 to 36 months in those first and only people of color roles because they're not set up to thrive. And it's quite culturally unsafe when they're the first few or only in the room, especially at senior decision-making tables. So I just caution that, yes, representation matters, but we've got to do it with full support and ensuring that that is continuous support, not just onboarding and letting someone swim in a very messy pool, murky waters. So beautiful collaboration, the two of you. I feel like we can take this on the road. I hope that RMIT invites Western Sydney and Western Sydney invites RMIT to have that conversation. You've shared so many vignettes of stories and experiences. So thank you for your generosity. We hope to continue the conversation in the higher ed sector. I feel if we come together regularly and share our learnings, we can only be better. So thank you so much, and we'll close this part of the panel discussion, and I'll hand back to Danny. I wish there was applause and we had an audience, but
Thanks so much, Div. Just a quick wrap up. So today's session, as you'll be aware, is recorded. So it'll be shared with all registrants and made available on the Watermark website. Feel free to share that with colleagues who might benefit from today's session. If you are interested in the Board Diversity Index report as well, that comes out on the 10th of June. So that will be on the Watermark website. So download it. Feel free to download it there. On behalf of MindTribes and Watermark, thank you all for your time and contribution. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with many of you beyond today.
Thank you, Danny.